All right. Hello, all. This is James Dorn. I'm the Governing Community Affairs Manager for NAMI, New York State, the National Alliance of Mental Illness chapter of the National Alliance of Mental Illness New York State entity. We're doing a lunch and learn series as part of a longer term series. We're going to continue into 2026, but we wanted to do webinars on complex policy topics that will possibly come up in the next legislative session, but are also things that people engage with every single day or might engage with as a person with mental illness. So the idea here is that each member feels that they're better able to both navigate the world and policies that they live in currently and be able to advocate for the policies that we fight for later on. With that, we will get started with our session today, the fundamentals of reasonable accommodation in the workplace. I'll turn it over to our speaker, Mark.
Thanks, James. Hi, everybody. I started talking to some of you before we turned on the tape because it seems like a nice conversational vibe, and that's exactly what I would love this Lunch and Learn to be. My name is Mark Fliedner, and I'm going to do something that we do at DRNY as a matter of course for those who maybe have sight impairment. I am a not young white guy sitting in my brown office. I got a sweater on because it's cold here in Brooklyn, New York, although maybe not as cold as where some of you are sitting. I'm wearing glasses and I guess that's what you need to know. My sweater is brown and the shirt underneath it is white. And real pleased to be representing disability rights in New York, which I'll explain a little bit more to you in a moment, as the director of the PAMI program, which is our mental health program. And with that, you can go ahead and James and get going on the PowerPoint when you're ready. Okay. So there you got my name and stuff, and you can make use of it later. That'll set the stage. Really glad to be here. Thanks, James. Okay, so I did want to tell you a little bit about DRNY, Disability Rights New York. DRNY is the protection and advocacy system for the state of New York. Every state's got one, whether you knew it or not. We are charged by Congress with protecting the rights of New York State residents with all different disabilities. I have the honor, as I indicated, of being the director of the PAMI program. That acronym stands for Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness. We address reports of abuse, neglect, and here we're ready to talk about rights violations against New Yorkers with significant mental health diagnoses. And we do it by using direct client services. People can call us or send in an intake form to seek assistance. We also do long-term investigations and monitoring of certain group settings like congregate settings like psychiatric facilities, youth facilities, prisons and jails, and so that we can see that there's no real concern about an abuse or a neglect going on. Sometimes we're responding to reports of abuse and neglect that we did hear about. And also, when it's required, we'll bring class action litigation in the federal courts. And I'm really proud to say that we regularly partner with NAMI New York State, and we hope to continue that into 2026. Thanks, James. So, yeah, let's see. Can we go back a little bit to, did we? Oh, the next one, that's great. Okay. We just wanted to make sure, when I talked to Nate, who's the great executive director of NAMI New York State right now, about what would be most useful to talk about, we did zero in on reasonable accommodations. I'll explain why in a minute. But the bottom line is we want you to know basically your rights as a person with a disability or as a caretaker advocate for a person with a disability. And this includes your right to obtain a reasonable accommodations as needed in employment, housing, education, and some other situations. Thanks, James. Again, I wanted to just be a little bit clearer about it to just reinforce why did I decide to talk to you folks about reasonable accommodations. because the plain and simple fact is the highest number of requests for assistance we've gotten in recent years to protect legal rights are from people who want assistance seeking reasonable accommodations at their work, school, their homes, etc. Thanks, James. So let's start by like building it legally. And I don't want to talk like a lawyer, okay? I'll do my best not to, but there are some legal fundamental principles that you may want to carry with you as a self-advocate, an advocate for somebody else that relate to asking for reasonable accommodations. And so we start with the definition of what a disability is. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Some of you who are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act know this definition. It also includes a record of such impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. So all of those kind of pieces of the definition would qualify you to be protected as a person with significant mental illness under the ADA. Thanks, James. So now let's talk about the definition of mental impairment that falls within that. It's a mental or psychological disorder that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Now, the words psychiatric, mental, or psychological come up, and I just wanted to talk about how they're both distinguished and defined. The words psychiatric disability and mental illness are, in the context of this law, used interchangeably, although we may not think of them that way in our life experience. The term mental illness under the law is typically used in a medical context to refer to a wide range of conditions related to emotional and mental health. The term psychiatric disability is typically used in a legal or policy context to refer to impairments covered the ADA, and that's why this psychiatric word is going to come up here more than it may come up in the context of your other work as in the the mental health field overall. The thing that I wanted to point out about reasonable accommodations is when you're seeking a reasonable accommodation, it doesn't mean you need a psychiatrist to document the need for a reasonable accommodation, even though the word psychiatric is in that term. Because we all know that people get assistance with mental health issues for a variety of ways now. It's not just taking medication prescribed by a psychiatrist. We're seeing caseworkers, we're seeing therapists, we're seeing peer counselors, we're seeing all of these great trained people. And so that all of their documentation of somebody's condition in support of a reasonable accommodation request is going to be of value. Thanks, James. And a working definition of reasonable accommodation. I don't know how many of you have heard this term before, but let's just start from the beginning. It's a modification or an adjustment made to a job, work environment, or application process that allows a qualified individual with a disability to perform essential job functions and enjoy equal employment opportunities. Now, I wanted to mention that most of the references I make today are going to refer to reasonable accommodation requests in the employment setting, and that would include when you're applying for employment. But they can be used again in school settings, higher education, all sorts of settings where you simply need there to be this modification or adjustment in order to do your best work or most enjoy the activity that is at issue. So I really wanted to be clear about that. So if you hear me keep referring to employment or job, that's because where most of our work is done, it doesn't mean it can't be applied in other circumstances. Thanks, James. What's reasonable? I mean, you say reasonable accommodation. What does that mean under the law? Accommodations are reasonable unless the change, exception, or adjustment would, now I'm seeing something that some folks say they can't hear. Is there any issue with audibility on anybody's part?
I
Anybody
can
else's
hear
part?
you.
Yeah, okay. So it appears, the person who wrote into the chat that it may be something on your end, okay? Sorry about that. So accommodations are considered reasonable under the law unless the change or exception or adjustment would, number one, impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the provider, or alter the nature of the provider's operations. When we say the provider, that means the person that we're asking to provide us with the reasonable accommodation. Now, I'm going to stop once in a while and say things anecdotally. And also, I also wanted to say that if you have questions that come up extemporaneously, I don't know how easily I'll be able to monitor them, but I know James would help me monitor them. And James, you can pipe in and let me know if there's a question that's come across that I might not be seeing. But what I wanted to say is that we started to get much, much more volume of people seeking our assistance when the kind of lockdown situation of COVID became, let's get back to the classroom, let's get back to our work settings. But the people that were talking to us were saying, but wait a minute, I was meeting all of my essential job functions. That's another term that we'll talk about in a minute, by working remotely, just like we're communicating remotely now. And so that there was this kind of drive, particularly here in New York City. Oh, we've got these office spaces that have been being left alone and people haven't been coming in, and we need to kind of force everybody. Oh, good. I'm so glad it worked out for you, Judith. Um, we need to force everybody to come back. And so that people with disabilities, including a lot of people with mental health diagnoses, were saying, wait a minute, I took this job while we were still all working remotely, or I've gotten better at being able to do this job because of the lack of distractions, because I'm working from home, because the commute was something that was really kind of traumatic for me because of my mental health diagnosis, whatever it is. And so the question becomes, is the failure to come into the office in that context an undue financial or administrative burden on the provider, on, let's say, on your employer? Or does it really alter the nature of the provider's operations? And lots of times when we look into it, the answer really is no. And we're trying to explain to the employer that it doesn't meet this legal standard for reasonableness. Thanks, James. Okay, so I did want to really address this at the outset. It sounds great. I can have a reasonable accommodation and I can work under the circumstances that I want to work. Why wouldn't I request a reasonable accommodation? Well, that's a lot of what I talk to folks about when they call us when they're getting ready to put in an application for a reasonable accommodation or something, is the reality that under the laws and the policies that provide us with the power to make reasonable accommodation requests, we are required to disclose our disability diagnoses to those who will be reviewing our request. So we are still, even though it's unfortunate, we're still in a world where some people, because of their own sort of self-stigmatization, or because they have concerns about the stigma that will be put on them by disclosing the nature of, thanks, James. He's going to be providing us with links that you can use that are part of the PowerPoint. Um, you know, we want we want folks to be able to get to be really comfortable with the decision. And the link that he's provided is that DRNY several years ago, when we were looking at this issue, did a whole series of presentations kind of like this. They were more in a panel form with two or three speakers and one of us, sometimes me, asking the questions. And it's about disability and disclosure. Because if you're somebody like I happen to be, who has a non-obvious disability, because I'm somebody who has my own mental health diagnoses, then you tend to go into a work setting, or let's say a higher education school setting, wanting to sort of fit in like everybody else. But and that's because of this persistent stigma that we have in our culture, and everybody on this phone call has to certainly be aware of it. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's really kind of reinforced by the statements that are made by politicians and people like that, who are blaming violent crime on people with mental health disorders and things like that. And or saying that everybody who's homeless is a person with a mental health disorder, that kind of thing. And so there's a real reluctance. And so what we did during the course of this disability and disclosure series was talk to folks about how they made the decision to disclose their disability so that they would be able to get reasonable accommodations. And it may not surprise you to know that I disclose my disability every time I have a conversation like this, including with clients one-on-one, because I feel like it's our job as best we can when we're ready to in our lives to disclose the fact that we have mental health disabilities, so that we take away all the stigma. Some people would use the word shame about it. And so you have to have that hard conversation with, let's say, a legal advocate, let's say your partner, your spouse, your family member, whatever, or just yourself. Am I comfortable disclosing this? And I'm going to say that obviously one cannot be discriminated against, at least not legally, by disclosing the fact that they have a mental health diagnosis. And until we do disclose it, we're not in a position to set ourselves up for requesting a reasonable accommodation, even if we don't need it right now. Like right now, I don't need any reasonable accommodations. But what if I need it later because of my mental health diagnoses? What if I need a reasonable accommodation that says that there's a certain kind of work that gets my anxiety to the point where it's out of control and it's not part of my essential job function? I might ask for the reasonable accommodation of not doing that extra piece of my work. I may need to work less hours than some people, but maybe more days of the week or whatever it is to meet my essential job functions. Or what we hear most often is I'd like to continue to work remotely because I have my emotional support animal with me. I have the things that I need to be able to focus without distractions. And working in a traditional work setting, let's say it's a cubicle somewhere or an office that's adjacent to another office or whatever it is simply not going to work for me. So I think that disclosure series could be really interesting because you'll see folks just like us who grappled with that decision and ultimately decided that it would be in their best interests, even though they have non-obvious disabilities, to be able to disclose the fact that they were a person with a disability. So thanks, James. So assuming that I made the decision that I was comfortable disclosing my disability or disabilities, I want to start with the law as it relates to when should I make a reasonable accommodation request. And the most important thing to know, and I alluded to it just a moment ago, is that you can do it at any stage when our access to the accommodation that will aid us in putting our best foot forward to do the job, let's say, to attain the job, home, school, admission, or whatever. And so that timing can include, let's say you're applying for a job, and let's say that the job requires you to take some kind of a clerical test to see how quickly you, can create a document, what your technology skills are, whatever it is. You may want to disclose that disability at the time of the application process, so they will be able to take into consideration if that testing, for example, takes you a little longer than somebody else. You also may want to disclose it at the time of the application process because you want to make sure you're working in a culture where that you are just as valued as everybody else and that there's no diminishment of your consideration for the job because of the fact that you have mental health diagnoses. You could do it at the time of a screening interview after, let's say, an application process where you actually had to fill out the forms and send them in. But when you're actually in an interview process, you may want to disclose it then. Again, if you feel that seeking a reasonable accommodation and saying, I just want to let you know that my responses to you may be a little bit more slower than somebody else's because in addition to a certain diagnosis, I might have some processing information. It doesn't mean that I understand it any less than anybody else. And of course, at the time of testing, specific testing, like I talked about that's required for a particular position. Thanks, James. How do I make my reasonable accommodation requests? So the plain and simple fact is you just have to use the policy or procedure that that particular employer or landlord or school that you're applying for or other entity requires. So you don't want to just send in a letter at the time of the application. You're going to do your homework at any time that you want to make a reasonable accommodation request to find out, and you can certainly go to your HR and ask that question, whatever the HR is in an employment setting, and say, how can I make a reasonable accommodation request that's consistent with the way this organization or this entity does it? And then once you've found out how to do that and you use the proper form, you go about securing written documentation. You support the request with written documentation from a provider that identifies the nature of your disability and the reasons why the accommodations that you're requesting will make it possible for you to meet all that is required of you. And in the employment setting, will allow you to continue to do the requirements of the position. I forgot to end my parenthesis there, James. I got to go over this next time I pull out this PowerPoint. So we're going to talk a bit about this because the written documentation from your provider is something that sometimes creates an impediment to people getting their accommodations. Before we leave this slide, I want to simply say that ideally, it's good to go to any provider or all of the providers that have worked with you at a time when you had these diagnoses, and they're in a position to understand what you can and can't do, given the nature of your diagnoses and how they manifest themselves, right, in work or school or whatever it is. In the housing situation, it can be that you have an emotional support animal and you need to disclose that because of your mental health diagnoses, it's imperative that you have this emotional support animal reside with you, and it's against the law if they don't let them. So DRNY can come back and talk about emotional support animals in great length because that's a separate topic on another day. But so let's go to the next slide. Thanks, James. DRNY has some tools that again are they are, if you actually had the PowerPoint or you have the link that James is going to provide, we've got some fact sheets that are available, and one of them specifically deals with reasonable accommodation requests support from medical providers, and it was created really to explain to the medical providers themselves what you're looking for. And the most important thing is that they really know you, and you really have talked to them about the fact that the accommodation that you're looking for is really it's the one that is going to work because you've tested it in various situations. And then the provider needs to specifically link what you're asking for to the accommodation that's being requested. For example, I was talking to a client recently who would be glad that I'm sharing our experience with you, who made a reasonable accommodation request. And then the employer came back and they wanted to simply continue working remotely from home. And they said it was basically because of the really hyper anxiety that they got in a cubicle situation, which is where they would be working in the work setting. And the employer came back and said, we don't accept your request, but we are saying that as an alternative, you can put on like ear devices that will block the noise, and you can do other things that will prevent you from distractions. And then we needed to go back to the provider, and in this case providers, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and say we need you to send a letter that is more descriptive, that draws a direct line between the accommodation that's being requested and the mental health diagnoses, and explains why the alternative that they're putting forward is not going to work. And then the provider was able to say, my client has used, noise blocking materials when he was in the work setting years and years ago. It did not allow him to escape the inability to focus that came when he got anxious, that kind of thing. I always tell clients and the providers to think of a document as a prescription. The bottom line is a doctor does not give any medicine that anybody asks for to anybody. The doctor gives a prescription for a medicine to the pharmacist, right, or calls it in, that is designed to deal with the very specific medical condition or psychiatric condition that a person has. And so the providers, and they're not lawyers, and they don't work in the law all the time. They may not be as adept as they would like to be at really creating a document that's very, very strong. And so, by the way, like that link that you get to on our site, it'll give you examples of some language from some letters that has been very helpful to us in the past. So, so the support from medical providers is actually a very, very key issue. And when we sent in the supplemental documentation from the provider, the employer got it. And they did ultimately consent to the reasonable accommodation, which is now in place. Thanks, James. So, and I do this to reiterate because sometimes the visual helps. The key to great medical documentation from your provider is that the document draws a direct line from the nature of the disability, including how the mental health diagnosis or diagnoses present themselves on a daily, hourly basis, and the reasonable accommodations being asked for. Another accommodation that folks have asked for in settings where they need to work in an office or let's say a store setting has been that some of our folks simply need a break sometimes that is because their anxiety is a certain level and they take some action, some breathing exercises, whatever it is, and then within 15 minutes they're able to come back. That is something that we've been able to arrange for as long as the medical provider was explain how that was going to sort of solve the problem. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I alluded to it earlier, is that if you have multiple providers, let's say you have a general practitioner who has known you for a long, long time, and there came a point in time when the doctor began prescribing you, among other things, mental health medications. The knowledge that that provider has, a general practitioner, an internist, or everyone, what you want to call it, may also be valuable in connection with a mental health provider, a therapist, or somebody that you're working with now. And so if you have a psychiatrist that prescribes medicine, if you've got a therapist, if you've got a counselor with certain degrees that has worked with you for a period of time, and understands why you need the accommodations, anybody that's worked with you on your mental health status, the more the better, because unfortunately these employers, et cetera, tend to be looking for sometimes for as much documentation as they can get and not really focusing on the great value of one document that we've provided. So next slide, James. Thanks. Now, what do I do if they deny my reasonable accommodation request? And this is very often where disability rights in New York gets involved because that's where the legal conflict comes into play. Okay. Now, what I want to say is at this point is, and I didn't want to kind of do a slide about it because it gets very wordy, but under the ADA and New York state law, which I give you some of the law later for you to have with some links, and also and under New York City law, which is one of the most robust civil rights laws actually in the world. Uh, there is a requirement that, let's say you make a reasonable accommodation request and they deny it flat out. This is something that we were seeing a lot when there was a period in time when the teachers were all told to go back to school, even though they had been doing this great job, or let's say the school counselors were told to go back to school. They've been doing a great job dealing with students remotely. And there was nothing about their job requirements that required them to be in person, especially like in the higher ed setting in some cases. So an employer can't just say everybody back to work, no questions asked. They are required to engage in a meaningful dialogue about the request that you've made. And if they say, why is it that you need this? You need to have an opportunity to explain to them even in more detail, maybe in the context of a meeting, maybe in a meeting where a legal advocate is sitting with you. If they say, why can't you use this accommodation instead? You have to be able to get back to them and say, because it won't work for the problem that I've addressed. And then another thing that needs to be discussed is these folks will say that we're requiring them to, change the whole way they do things. It's going to be expensive given the standard that I gave you a little while ago. And you're allowed to challenge them and say, wait a minute, I've been doing this work, remotely, let's say, for 5 years now. I met all of my essential job functions. I did everything I was supposed to do. And there's nothing that I have to do to come into the office. If they create a situation, for example, where, oh, they just decided they wanted to have weekly staff meetings, and so everybody had to be in 1 day a week, then you need to talk about whether this one person who needs the reasonable accommodation can engage in the staff meeting remotely and still have complete access to all the information. So there's got to be a dialogue. And in some cases where the employer or the, let's say, a school of higher education or something like that is really, really being frustrating with us and really not listening to our point of view, you may want to seek legal advocacy to support you. So let's say your reasonable accommodation is denied because they didn't engage in that meaningful dialogue or they just didn't get it. The first thing you do procedurally is you ask for a written notice of denial. It's not just enough for your supervisor to call you and say it was denied. You need to know in writing when that denial was decided on, and ideally what the basis for it was. Why were they saying it was denied? And then you ask how long you have to appeal the decision. Because if we feel like what you are looking for is absolutely reasonable on all the circumstances as you've explained them to us, as supplementary documentation has showed us, we are going to say to you, you should definitely appeal that decision and have it considered again. And that's the kind of circumstance where maybe we'll ask the providers to do a stronger letter, a more detailed letter explaining why the accommodation is so critical. Sometimes in the time between when you filed the request and the time you get the appeal, things may have gotten worse in terms of, sort of like manifestations of your mental illness. Let's say if it's anxiety, it may have gotten more acute, so it's harder for you to function simply because the conversation about you having to come into the office is taking place. Then the provider is going to want to update that information and make sure that they know that it's worse than it was when we first made the appeal. And then it's really important to get your appeal in on time. And you also want to find out how the procedure, what is their procedure for filing the appeal, because every organization may have a different procedure and you want to make sure you want to get it right. These are the things we always tell our clients who are doing these things exclusively as self-advocates as best they can. Thanks, James. Now let's talk a little bit about the laws that prohibit discrimination, meaning they do not allow it anywhere against people with disabilities. Again, the federal law this is all legal stuff. You don't have to know it, but it's good for you to have for your records if you're ever in this situation. And so you can also, I'll tell you where you can reach out to me and I can send you the PowerPoint if you want it by email. It's Section 5 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act that came before that. That's where the federal law prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, including people with mental health disabilities who are seeking reasonable accommodations. So if they mess up this process, yes, there's an argument to be made that they have violated the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act and that you should consider taking action against them. So that would be federal. It could be theoretically a federal complaint, but you can also cite the federal law and let's say an EEOC complaint, an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaint, or some other administrative complaint, and I'll talk about those on the next slide. Thanks, James. And then in terms of the administrative complaints that I just referred to, at the New York State level, you can make a complaint with the New York State Division of Human Rights. I'll tell people to be really careful of timing. You have to file that 3 years from the date of the last act of discrimination that they engaged in. Let's say they denied it, then they made some discriminatory comment that made you realize they didn't understand the law thereafter. It could be that last day when they made the comment, as you've documented. And how do you do it? The New York State Division of Human Rights has pretty much made it so that you don't need a lawyer to be able to file it. Thank you so much, James, for sharing that information. Online, you can submit a discrimination report through the New York State Division of Human Rights website. There you've got the link. and by mail. You can download and fill out a complaint form, sign it, and then submit it to the division with any other supporting documents that you think would be valuable. And then in New York City, if you happen to be there, like I told you, I'm sitting in Brooklyn, you can send a complaint to the New York City Commission on Human Rights. There, as you can see by looking at the slide, it's a more limited time frame. You only have 1 year to file from the date of the last act of discrimination, so you have to be aware of your timing if you feel like you want to file an administrative complaint. Now, just to be clear, if you were uh, if you were too late, more than 1 year after the filing, and you wanted to file, if you're a New York City resident, you can still file under the state human rights law. Okay. And the New York City Commission on Human Rights is the acronym is CCHR. You can file online or by mail, or you can go right into their law enforcement bureau office in Lower Manhattan if you're a New York City person. Thanks, James. All right, so I'm glad that I don't have more to say that's really specific, because I want to see if you guys have questions. The DRNY contact information for more specific information, or if you think you need legal advocacy from us and we're able to provide it given our resources, which seem to always be getting limited, we really want to hear from you. So there's a phone number, there's a toll-free number if you need to use the toll-free. There's a fax if anybody uses that any before. I think the only people that use fax anymore are the Social Security Administration, and I don't know why they do that, but our local Social Security offices seem to want faxes still. You can always send an email to mail@drny.org, or you can send it directly to me because you've joined me on this conversation today. And it is MARC dot, it's on the first page, but let's go back over it. F like in Frank, LIE, D like in David, NER, and again at drny.org. And then, if you'd like to ask for assistance online with an online intake form, you go to www.drny.org, where we have a lot of resources that I might not have had a chance to touch on, and you can fill out a form online. When you call the main phone number at the top of the slide, you're going to get our intake department, and they're going to connect you with somebody that you can talk to about your questions or concerns. I hope I didn't get too lawyerly, and I would love to know if anybody has some questions about the things that I've been chatting about for the last few minutes.
It's Jackie here.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, I have a question. It's kind of
Sure.
it's an after the fact thing. And by the way, this is a wonderful presentation.
Oh, if it was helpful, I'm so glad.
Thank you so much, and thank you, James, for hosting this. So my sister has a disability, a kind of brain injury issue, and it's led to a lot of cognitive and speech issues and distraction issues and all sorts of things. And so when she used to do a lot of big public speaking at public service commission hearings and this and that, but she kind of loses the thread now. Like she has to follow a real script. But sometimes we speak off the cuff at a town hall meeting, one of our own. And so we decided when we speak with the PSC, all she has to do is check the box that says she has a disability, and for her it means she gets time and a half. So instead of 3 minutes, she gets 4.5 minutes.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
So she's never used this extra time. It's just a nice cushion to know it's there, right?
And for everybody else's sake, Jackie, that is a reasonable accommodation. That's a perfect example of a
Correct.
reasonable accommodation.
Correct. And that's why the PSC and other, state agencies offer it. So we tried this at our own local, and she had to provide a letter. It was too hard to reach her neurologist, but the therapist that she was having cognitive therapy with and speech therapy with wrote a terrific letter. And we turned it into the clerk who's in charge of the town board meetings. And he was fine with it. And he went to tell the timekeeper and the supervisor, the town supervisor, that this person, whenever she speaks now, is entitled to extra time, and they shouldn't question that and just give it, just make it easy. Well,
Okay, sounds great so far.
she got up to speak. They somehow the supervisor decided to humiliate her and started reading the letter out loud. So everyone on the town board in the room could know. It was so horrible. She was not, Jossie's always been very able and willing to talk about her disabilities, psychiatric and physical
Right.
and cognitive, etc. But that's her choice. So it was just kind of done publicly. It was like the supervisor just wanting to humiliate someone. And, I just wonder, what do you do? What can you do to like make your local agencies aware that that's not appropriate?
Man, that's a great question, and based on a very compelling description of something that happened in real life that any of us could use if we were making a similar request. Now, I assume that the accommodation was granted,
Mhm.
correct? And yeah,
But
the
it was read
issue,
into the
what was
record.
discriminatory was that he put it in a context where she was made to feel uncomfortable, at least before she was able to make the statement,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it was read into the record, so to speak, before she got to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah. And let's use our common sense. If he felt the need to put that in the record to explain for the record that that was happening, he could have done that outside of the presence of the other people that were attending the meeting in advance of the meeting, that kind of thing, or thereafter. That's ridiculous. It's time to make a discrimination, it's time to reach out and say that this is violative of their rights. But one thing that is really interesting that you raised, Jackie, that we can all learn from is if our accommodation has us under circumstances where a large group of people could theoretically be informed of the reason why you have the accommodation. I'm going to learn from this that I want to tell people to notify them that please do not disclose this. It's not a responsibility to do that. Don't
Right.
misunderstand me. But when we keep learning about ignorant things like this, think about proactive tools that we can use. So, I mean, if I were agitated about it, like I think you were, and it's your community, I would write and try and do some education
Mm.
about how this kind of thing causes further stigmatization, causes further separation of my sister from everybody else culturally and everything else, and that it's really harmful. You would hope that somebody on the board would acknowledge it. If you have a situation where they did grant the accommodation, but because of the way it went down, there was actual harm that was caused, you could consider filing a complaint with one of these administrative complaints, but you're not going to focus on the fact that they didn't give you the reasonable accommodation. You're going to focus on the way that they went about it.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does. I suppose it could have just also been an opportunity for her to turn around to the room at large and say, yes, I have a disability. It would have been my right to disclose this, but for some reason the supervisor felt it was his.
That is absolutely, and the thing is that what is violative about this is that really bothers me as an attorney is that when we do disclose these disabilities, and I said that was one of the big decisions when you want to go down this route, and I encourage us to, is that you're telling the only person that needs to know that information so that they can make a decision about the reasonable accommodation. It is not to be made public to even your other, your supervisor, your employers. It's either granted or it's not. So when you give a scenario where it's actually literally in the public sector, it's a very, very disturbing narrative to hear. And it's why we have to keep educating people about what discrimination looks like. And keep saying, why is it that you would never have drawn, you probably wouldn't have drawn people's attention to the fact that somebody was a wheelchair user or that they, were using an ASL interpreter any more than it, needs to be obvious. Why would you put us in that position? And that's kind of our job as warriors as we continue fighting for what's right. Now, I do want to make sure that I get to Judith's question because I know she's had her hand up for a while now. Hi, Judith.
Hello. Um, I'm 87, so I'm not asking on behalf of myself truly, but I want to know, this is a real situation for other people. For
Mhm.
people who have mood disorders, um, sometimes, they can go for long periods of time without a breakthrough. And then either because they have a manic attack or something happens that there's an incident at work. Perhaps they just get silly, perhaps they get insulting, perhaps they use poor judgment in a way that really doesn't, affect the overall success of the enterprise.
That's
And I know, as the daughter of somebody who had mood disorders, how this feels on the other end. It can be very painful to the people around you. In your experience, what is a good way to handle this other than just slinking away?
you mean after it's already
It's
I'm getting an
happened.
echo now for a second, James. I don't
I'm
know why.
sorry. Yes, if something happens, in a situation where they may already have revealed that there's someone with a mood disorder, and in a situation where perhaps they didn't feel a need because they've worked for, they've been successful in just
Right.
controlling it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so is it a situation where the reasonable accommodation was asked for that, let's say I need to take a break for 15 minutes, like I mentioned, or I need to go take some kind of a medication that I know might ease me through this, and then maybe take the minutes that it will take in order for it to impact my body? Was that in place or not in
No,
place in
and
your scenario?
in other people's instances, people either just slunk away. I'm too embarrassed. My relationships are too bad. I'm going to do something else. Or they were fired and accepted it. But
Okay.
that's to me not necessarily
Right.
only or the best solution. So
No.
just some
Yeah.
advice on, if someone gets in a situation, or the alternate is that people who have mood disorders go into a depression. Although my primary diagnosis is, well, look, she hears voices. I did get depressions, and what I once got an evaluation which said my work wasn't consistent. But fine. At every point, it was above the level of expectations, and you're pinning on me that it wasn't consistent. So, from the point of view of someone who has depression and isn't consistent, but I'm more worried about younger people in my household
I, yeah.
who,
I,
really do something that's upsetting. And how do they come back from that? What can they do to hold on
Well,
to?
I think that if they didn't see it coming and they hadn't asked for a reasonable accommodation to try and address it, maybe maybe this is a manifestation or manifestations of a condition that they're really just learning about, right? They just wouldn't have known. Then I think that the most important thing to do is to put it in a clinical context for the employer so that their rights are preserved, and then say, now that I know this is something that I need, and I've talked to professionals about it, and we've come up with this plan for how to address it so it won't impact things at the work setting, for example. I need to ask for this reasonable accommodation, and they can't be discriminated against for asking for that. Oh, thank you, Dorothy, for saying thank you. And I want to get to these questions. I appreciate it. But the main thing, Judith, is that I think that, you're in your 80s. I'm in my 60s. We were raised in a time when nobody talked about this.
Mhm.
Nobody nobody, I don't think, would have been comfortable proactively saying, this is my condition, and this is how I can be the best employer you're ever going to have if you just let me have these accommodations put in place. And so I think the best thing we can do, Judith, and I hope it doesn't sound like a non-answer, and I also do want to get to Rena because she's had her hand up a couple times, is that I think we have to keep being proactive. We have to keep being sort of like the champions for the next generation and the current generation to make sure that they're protected by saying, this is the way the law works. And if you don't follow the law, it's discrimination. And if you want great employees, you can't exclude everybody who may have the possibility of needing a reasonable accommodation. Again, I hope that doesn't sound lame, but this is a conversation we need to keep continuing to come up with good ideas. So I do want to, in like just a few minutes, see, and Rena, I know you had your name up a couple times and I didn't, your hand up a couple times, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to get to you if you did want to ask something.
Okay, it's not a question. It's thank you to you and to um, Matthew. I'm sorry, not Matthew, James. In the old days,
Oh,
just for doing this. I worked at the Independent Living Center for several years before I retired. This information is so important. I still give it out to people as much as I can, and I'm so glad to have this. It was so clear and so answered a lot of questions in advance. So thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you for saying that. Well, the good news is you can tell people this will be on accessible by NAMI's what, YouTube, or the website goes to the YouTube, however it's done, right?
So we'll be putting a copy of the recording of this webinar up on our YouTube page and then linking to it on our advocacy page. So this Lunch and Learn, as well as all of our last Lunch and Learns, will be available on our website for you to refer back to.
That's so great. And I also want to say, like, listen, and we try and serve as many people as we can, but when I have an opportunity to do it in this context where we can talk to a bunch of people at once and give the information, it's ideal because there's only so many hours in a day. But there are resources on our website as well. But if you know somebody that sounds like, based on what you know about the fundamentals of the law right now, has been discriminated against or needs a hand, an advocacy hand in fighting against an organization, for example, that is just way off base about this. You'd be amazed how many people do not understand how this law works, and they blatantly violate it because they just don't get it. And keep spreading the word with me. And then if somebody needs a hand, please reach out to DRNY. Even if we don't have the immediate resources, we have great referrals. We'll give you every piece of information that we can with the resources that we have. And, when we partner with folks like NAMI to get the word out, things get easier. James mentioned to me that once we got to know each other better in what I did, because I spoke at their great conference a few weeks ago, he sent us a referral. So we are here. And as long as Congress keeps sending us money, like they're supposed to, and doesn't, have a big debate about that and do something unfortunate, we are going to be here. And even when they do, we are going to give you every bit of service that we possibly can. Such a pleasure to be with you all today.
So with that, we don't see any other questions. Before we hit the pause recording button, we're just going to share our next Lunch and Learn series is going to be on ERPOs, also known as Extreme Risk Protection Orders. It'll feature a speaker from the Chief Counsel for Gender and Family Violence at the New York State Office of Court Administration. It'll be the first Monday of the month. That'll be our first one for January 2026. So that'll be January 5th at 1 p.m. via webinar. The link will go out in the chat. With that, we'll turn off the recording. If you have any questions you didn't want to ask while it was recording, you can start there.